conference with a very interesting first panel. Excuse me!
Water!
Thank you, that's better. So we'll start our second panel now, as we're only running a little bit behind schedule now, so thank you for the cooperation in a very quick coffee break. After this we have a lunch break where if you you can wander around the campus, and there are various places where you can go and get food on campus. If you ask either Francis or myself or Ben Jones when he re-emerges, then we can recommend somewhere for you to go and get some food. Equally, I would point out that we have a panel this afternoon that currently only has 2 presenters in it, so if there's anyone from a panel tomorrow that has 4 presenters in that would like to move to this afternoon, then please talk to Francis in the lunch break. Equally,
we already decided that we will be in the...
Yeah, but there's a 4-person panel tomorrow, so there's only 2 currently, including you. Equally, we have a number of books here and people touting their wares around as well, so any of the Socialist History Society publications, please talk to Francis, and you'll find the prices on the back for that.
And the Institute of Working Class History, based in Chicago, has free pens and keychains over there by Francis, so help yourself. It has our website address on it.
Excellent, thank you very much. And otherwise, you'll find other people milling around generally in the vicinity of their publications as well. So we'll make a start on this second panel. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Sharif Gemie from the University of South Wales, who's going to talk to us about racism, Orientalism and anti-colonialism on the Hippy Trail, 1957 to 78.
Thank you. As you can see, it's quite a full title, and I think one problem I've got straight away is the Hippy Trail, because I'm almost certain that none of you will have ever read anything about the Hippy Trail, and I can be sure of this because myself and my co-researcher, Brian Ireland, are engaged in writing the first history of the Hippy Trail. So I'm going to start my paper by just telling you a bit about what was the Hippy Trail, and then I'll move on to the more substantial political issues. For those of you who don't know, the Hippy Trail was a route that flourished between about 1957 and 1978. Here, usefully symbolised at particular places with cannabis leaves. Only about 30% of the travellers ever got to Kathmandu. But many of them stopped along the way. And what the map doesn't make quite clear is there was a sort of lesser route, a cheaper, more practical one, down south to Morocco as well. And this was flourishing really in the late 60s and early 70s. I've been an academic researcher for about 30 years, and there are some very unusual aspects of this topic. The first one is its almost entirely informal nature, not organised by a state, not organised by an institution, not organised by any major firm, no official starting date, no flag, no leader, no official membership, no philosopher, no agreed canon of literature. There are some books associated with it, and above all for historians, obviously, no archive. Almost to the point where you might say, well, does it actually exist? Well, it does exist in that the people who did it remember it and will recall that term. It's chronologically very specific. Putting it in very simple terms, it's starting at the end of British imperialism. You might date the end of British imperialism to the Suez Crisis of 1956, and it's ending really with the great wave of Islamophobia, which was in reaction to the Iranian Revolution of 1978. And some of the people doing the trail in the 60s and 70s were aware of what an unusual chance they had and how they were going to take advantage of it. Understanding its character is a bit more difficult. One way of looking at it might be to think of it as a sort of constant demonstration, possibly the longest and biggest pacifist demonstration ever in history. Because there's no doubt that people doing the Hippy Trail went with non-violent intentions. The numbers of people doing the Hippy Trail will never be established. Brian and I are very confident to say several 100,000, probably several million. But the actual data there is very hard to be certain of. And Another point of comparison is to think of it as a secular pilgrimage. It's like a pilgrimage in that it draws people out of ordinary society. It's like a pilgrimage in that it creates a sense of solidarity. People meet each other, people from different countries meet each other, and there is this sense, particularly amongst the hippie traders, of a sort of youth international being created by their movements. Brian and I have been researching this topic for about 4 years now, and we have established a database of 77 hippie trail narratives. 35 of these are publications. A handful of them are commercially published, but very few. In recent years, what has happened is not so much a wave, but a steady trickle of self-publications, and above all, self-publications as e-books as well. Usually by people obviously in their late 60s and early 70s. And alongside that, some pretty substantial contributions to various websites. So I'm not going to claim that this is a scientifically chosen cross-section of people. It's very much a preliminary survey, but I hope you'll accept that 77 does count for something, and it is a basis for generalisation. One point I'll make in qualitative terms as well straight away, looking at those 77 publications, almost a complete absence of colonial references, which in itself is very telling, I think. So looking at those 77 a bit closer, who were they? 23 women and 54 men. And Brian and I feel pretty confident that that is a fairly accurate representation of the sex ratio, 2 to 1, sometimes maybe even 3 to 1, travelling east. 20 of them with university degrees, and 6 of them with other forms of higher education qualifications. In other words, about a third of them had been to HE of some form or another. This is far greater than the national average in Britain in the 1970s. I'm quoting from memory, I think it's only about 8% of 18-year-olds go to university in 1970. So it's a suggestion of a relatively elevated social class, but obviously not 100% of them had university degrees, and a qualification I'd want to make straight away is there definitely were working class hippie trailers. They did do the trail, they did contribute, and they did participate in a full sense. The average age is a statistic we do feel pretty confident about. Most of them leaving were about 23 and a bit, and that's quite consistent. You can almost fill in the details yourself. The hippie trail was something people did after a university degree, and also after their first experiences of work. Most of them wanted to save some money, so it didn't attract the very young. And a little bit more of a breakdown there of our 77, 12 teenagers, but 53 in their 20s. So that is the generation who are at the centre of the hippie trail. And another qualification, very few of the people doing the hippie trail would have described themselves as hippies. And we were able to talk to our interviewees about this, and of our 32 interviewees, only 2 of them would have accepted the title hippies. And then we would then ask a supplementary question, well, if you weren't hippies, what were you? And they come up with these other terms. There is some fairly clear tendencies there. For some people, the word hippie is simply too wild, too rebellious, too anti-establishment, and they prefer terms which suggest just practical, cheap forms of travelling, and that would be words like backpackers, campers, overlanders, shoestring travellers. For other people, on the contrary, the word hippie was too commercial, too manipulated, too empty of meaning, inauthentic, and they're the ones who prefer terms like beats or beatniks, freaks, groovers, heads. Hippie trailers is used really as a sort of euphemism. Intrepids, nomads, revolutionaries, seekers, and spiritual tourists. The term itself, hippie trail, as far as we can see, is coined about 1969, but it's then often applied retrospectively. There isn't really another word for describing that route, and it doesn't seem to be used so much today. By and large, those 77 hippie trailers have a very positive attitude towards the local cultures they're looking forward to meet. And one way of demonstrating that is by referring to a metaphor that they often use, which is to say, it's like coming home. And this maybe reflects Hermann Hesse, who in one of his works does talk about the eternal strivings of the human spirit towards the East, towards home, towards the home of light. But I think quite independently, a number of our interviewees reach for the same metaphor. Vincent, who in 1969, all the interviewees' names have been changed, by the way. Vincent, 1969, crossing into India, and he tells us, it's as though I'd come home. William, again, arriving in India in 1969, this is right, it all makes sense. Kay, who in 1975, Dr. Amritsar, and comments in his interview, this is it. And finally, a publication by a pseudonymous short site, 1973, when he first reads about Buddhism, again comments, it's like coming home. And obviously this is very different from a colonial perspective. These are people travelling east and saying, this is like coming home. I want to give you some more detailed examples of attitudes on the hippie trail. The first is actually a self-published work. I can explain the title, but it will take too long. Geoffrey Shortsight is obviously a pseudonym. This is a luxuriously produced work, thick, glossy paper, professionally laid out, well-placed, well-chosen photographs, so it's a high-class sort of work. And it tells the story of 3 longish trips to Afghanistan, trips of 2 or 3 months, all in the early 1970s. And at one point, Geoffrey Shortsight noticed that Afghans are wearing sandals made from recycled lorry tyres. And he then comments, the Afghans are just brilliant at this recycling, managing to rebuild or restore absolutely everything with nothing ever thrown away. Maybe that is another reason I felt such an affinity with them. And you can see here where it's moving to sort of dodgy territory. Although on reflection, I realised it actually went much deeper than that, for they seem to come from a different age, when men cared for and looked after their tools, and respected machinery in a manner now long forgotten by the Western world in its renewable era of disposable values. Okay, it's not great writing. I think we accept at face value he has a sincere admiration for the Afghans he meets, and I think we should also accept he's identified quite a sort of nice little point. The idea of making sandals out of recycled lorry tyres does seem like quite a good idea. The points where it becomes a bit more dubious is where Shortsight is claiming, and he actually uses this word, affinity. He doesn't speak any of the local languages of Afghanistan. He has very little understanding of Islam. He's basically an outsider, but he's feeling this confidence of being able to place these people in a different time, in a different culture. Obviously, this resembles Said's concept of Orientalism. Shortsight probably never knew about that, but that's irrelevant. It's a sort of Orientalist vision that's coming out. The second example, Marguerite van Geldermalsen. She's actually Australian, but her parents were from the Netherlands, and they moved to Australia. She's one of the few of our selection who also self-identifies as a hippie. She's travelling in Jordan in the early 1970s. She does meet this guy, and they do eventually get married. They do have a long and happy marriage. They do have 3 children, and it only ends when her husband dies of a diabetes-related illness. But early on in her account, she does talk about her life in Jordan, and she does make this one comment about listening to a recital of the Quran in the Petra Valley. The Petra Valley is a very beautiful place. But she comments, I didn't need to understand a word. It was made for this world, especially for such mornings as we watched in awesome wonder as the valley awakened and the sunlight slipped down the rock face in our view. Now, again, let's accept that she's sincere, but the disappointing quality of this is how she's prepared to look at Islam simply as a spectacle, as something to be watched and something to be observed, and the fact she doesn't understand it doesn't really seem to bother her. In the years to come, she was to understand Islam a bit more. She never formally converts. She picks up a bit of Arabic, but one's still left with that impression again of a rather sort of passive watching. I should have said she's one of the few of our sources that was published by a commercial publisher. Virago actually published this. And final source I want to cite, this has got a rather unusual publication history, which I won't go into here, but Michael Hall travels to Afghanistan in 1976, and the scene I want to tell you about, he travels from Herat in the south of Afghanistan to Mazar-e-Sharif in the north of Afghanistan, and he travels in a sort of convoy of jeeps driven by Afghanis, and most of the other passengers are Afghanis. And he comments on the experience of travelling. Our hair was so matted, our comb broke in two, and our clothes were caked with dust and sand, but we both felt exhilarated. What a country, what a people. These unassuming villagers exuded an infectious friendliness, and 10 minutes after getting into any jeep, we felt we had known our fellow passengers for weeks. It's a better quality of writing, and the claim he's making, although he's very exuberant, very happy about it, the claim he's making is actually much more limited. He is literally rubbing shoulders with these people, and doing that, he feels a sort of friendliness with them, and he uses a much more sort of focused and moderate claim. I want to now cite a couple of examples from interviews, and these are moments that the interviewees themselves selected as important, as summarising their experiences. Anne records again a moment in Petra in Jordan. I climbed away from the rest, and a young Bedouin woman sat next to me. She held my hair and compared it with her copper bangles. She gave me a bottle of Coca-Cola. That's strange. It's a very, very sweet moment. And Alan, who wasn't quite so eloquent, so I have paraphrased his words, he takes up an invitation from a carpet dealer, I think in Tehran, to visit his house. He finds inside the house there's no furniture, just carpets, cushions and tables. There's a student around to help translate the conversation, and Alan then sums it up. They were very, very sweet to us. The importance of this, though, both of these interviewees have said, this is what sums up the trip, this is what it was all about. This was the important bit. And you can see again, they've, particularly in Anne's case, they're getting away from a colonial vision. They're only 10, 15 years away from the Suez Crisis, but they're looking at the Eastern world in a different way. Now that's not to say that all of the hippie traders have these sort of very rosy and happy views of Eastern local cultures. And one contra-example comes from Goa. Goa in southwest India became a sort of hippie republic in the late 60s, still is today, and there was a pretty much permanent presence of hippie traders there for 12 months of the year. And in a sense, things became reversed, because the hippie traders then actually resented visits by Indian tourists coming to look at them. And there was this... the world is complicated. And there was this resentment that the tourists didn't really appreciate what they were doing. And one word which did circulate amongst the hippie traders in Goa was to call these Indian tourists buffaloes. Now this is clearly pejorative, and you might even want to say it's actually racist. So there was that strand. Going back to Michael Hall, travelling from Herat up to Mazar-Sharif, there's also an incident which occurs on that journey. He's not the only Westerner. There are some other Westerners there with cameras. The Westerners with cameras soon discover that the Afghan male jeep drivers are quite happy to have their photographs taken and quite happy to pose in front of the jeeps, but the female Afghan women do not want to have their photographs taken by any means. And this actually causes an incident at one point with one backpacker protesting, I didn't come all this bloody way not to be able to take whatever photographs I want. So he is talking in the language of possession. He is trying to say, you know, I've come this way, therefore I've got the right to possess these people, metaphorically. I mean, this could be linked to a colonialist mind frame. But these incidents, I would want to insist, are minor or exceptional rather than typical of the hippie trail. Moving on to my last example, which was a photograph which one of our interviewees gave us. And I didn't really get the chance to look at the photograph till after the interview, but firstly I thought it was a beautiful photograph, but I wanted to know a bit more about what it was. And I was in a sense deliberately playing a trick on Steve, because I wanted to hear what he would say about this photograph. So I wrote back to him and said, what's going on here? Can you explain what this photograph is about? And he replied, the travellers in the picture I remember as being very English and might just have been on the same bus as me. The locals would be kids trying to improve their English, and others likely just passers-by or boatmen or people wanting to show off their neighbourhood. There were also a lot of Tibetan refugees around, with a settlement just outside the town. The interesting thing is he's able to locate them. He doesn't just say, oh, there were some Nepalese. He's actually able to sort of fill in a bit of their life history. And the other thing, all right, it is just a photograph, and photographs can be deceptive. The other thing that strikes me is the impression of equality you've got. You can't look at that photograph and say, well, one group's in charge and the other group is sort of waiting and attending them. If you look very closely, there's also a guitar there. Often music was a way of transcending linguistic barriers, religious barriers, cultural barriers. Without being fanciful, you can imagine them sort of sharing songs with each other. But the overall impression there is of a relative equality. And that, again, it's quite an achievement. They've managed to travel to the east, they've managed to meet local people, which is what they wanted, and they're managing to at least share a moment of calm, perhaps a moment of beauty with them. So I think that does deserve to be credited as an achievement. Okay, moving to my conclusion. Firstly, the obvious qualification. There are lots of people doing the Hippy Trail, lots of different reasons. There is a variety of opinion. And again, in our interviews, we found sometimes when we asked very sort of sharp questions like, why did you go? We were just getting very, very vague answers. So there's certainly room for a great variety of opinion. But the second point I want to make is that these people are travelling often to ex-colonial countries, or countries at least that were confronting colonialism, and they're travelling to those countries and they're able to see them without a colonial perspective. They're able to look at India with not exactly fresh eyes, but at least non-colonial eyes. And that's, again, quite an achievement. Bearing in mind, that Suez in 1956 wasn't so far away. Obviously, they are reproducing some distorted visions, and there are clear echoes of Said's concept of Orientalism. They have highly idealistic visions of what India should be, what Eastern countries should be. They're often very romantic visions as well. So they're by no means accurate, but I would still say this is a very positive form of Orientalism. And the last point, a point which I think you can gain from Steve's photograph, the points they themselves choose as central to their trips are this sort of meeting. This is what they're looking for. It is a relatively egalitarian contact between peoples from different cultures. I'll end there, so.
Well, thank you, Sharif, for an absolutely fascinating paper. It's my great pleasure to now welcome back Bill Pelz, who was here for our last conference 2 years ago. Bill is from the Institute of Working Class History in Chicago, who are co-sponsoring this conference as well. And Bill will be talking to us on the subject of the view from across the Great Pond.
U.S. intelligence on the European left, 1945 to 1968. Okay. Thank you. First of all, passing around copies of my paper, which is also up on the website. I want to apologize. It's a very rough draft. It's not in any sort of really completed form, but I just wanted to sort of present this and point out some examples of what I've found so far by looking at U.S. intelligence documents. And that is, as you might imagine, U.S. intelligence is often seen as a contradiction of terms or a joke. That's not completely inaccurate. However, given the huge amount of money that the United States spent, it would be pretty inconceivable that they wouldn't reveal something about the American intelligence mentality, perhaps, but also maybe actually come across various sort of interesting facts, various sort of things where they'd sometimes actually, come across things. So, like, for example, the British Labour Party, which I don't have too many special documents on, when British Labour wins in 1945, they report sort of, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, that the British intelligence services, who they're liaisoning with, don't seem to be terribly enthusiastic about the new government. But they then qualify that by saying that is because British intelligence is more or less a self-selected, and I'm quoting here, self-contained elite traditionally recruited from traditionalist classes. Nearly all of its staff officers have private means, and indeed they must so as a rule. So they sometimes have little sort of comments like that are interesting, but they also sort of sometimes reveal, at least from the Washington perspective, what the power relations are. So for example, former General and later President Dwight D. Eisenhower is quoted in a secret memo as evaluating Great Britain, and I'm pointing this out because there are many British people here, that although it would hurt British pride, he said we should tell the British, and apparently they did in a secret memo, that Britain had little future on its own. And it had one of two choices. It either had to join with the European continent or join the United States and become maybe 3 states in the United States. Now, if this was just some random coup, you'd say, well, why is he bother wasting our time with it? This was the Supreme Commander of D-Day, blah, 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 but also a 2-term, very influential American president. And this was the secret advice he was telling the British government. I unfortunately don't know what the British government response was. They probably said, no, we don't want to do either. You know, how could we, oppress our ex-colonials if we did that? So I'm not clear what they said. But when you talk about getting little traces of things, many of you may have heard, but many of you may not have heard, of the Antifa movement in Germany at the end of World War II, where spontaneous anti-fascist committees came up, sometimes organized by the German Communist Party, sometimes by various socialist groups, but they were coalition and they were spontaneous. Right? They were very much from the bottom up, and the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, documents that they were very much democratic and from the bottom up. And because they were democratic and from the bottom up, they were very, very dangerous. Right? Because, and I'm quoting from the documents here, here, without waiting for military government and continuing after them, even in occupation, they would take over administration powers. So what is the answer that the intelligence people propose? They attack them, and this will be a pattern you see in terms of American intelligence advice, both overtly, breaking up their demonstrations, dismissing their administrations under area of military occupation of the United States or their allies, or just denying them resources, like not allowing them to have resources such as paper for putting out flyers and newspapers. Now, on the other hand, while you get these little sort of nuggets of sort of interesting facts that sometimes are missed in the grand narrative of history, particularly about the left, you also see how completely American intelligence was wearing blinders by the anti-communism and Cold War. So, for example, I want to freely admit that among my many failings as a historian, I know very little about Iceland. I know it's an important country. I should know more about Iceland. However, I seem to think that when American intelligence sent an urgent memo to Washington at the end of 1949, saying that, and this is a direct quote, a lack of effective internal security forces in Iceland means the communists have the capability of seizing power by a coup d'etat. Now, in point of fact, for people who don't know Icelandic history as well as I do, the communists never seized power in the United States. But if you think that's hysterical, there's a memo by J. Edgar Hoover where they debriefed some secret French sources about what's going on in the French government, and I cite this in my paper, and it's a long thing, it's from 1946. And it talks about the French intelligence services, quote, under absolute control of the communists. The Republican Party, the MRP, has a secret agreement with the Communist Party, so Communist Party members run to get bourgeois votes, but they're secretly communists. The key posts, this direct quote, in the civil service, in the Air Force, and the gendarmerie are in the hands of the Communist Party. This party, who represents less than 1/3, could paralyze the whole country on J-Day. You may ask, what is J-Day? According to the FBI, J-Day, and this is what I mean about they sort of go off the rails with their paranoia, J-Day is the day chosen by Moscow to act. At the chosen time, I'm not misquoting, the Russian army would peacefully and without resistance occupy the south of France to invade Spain and strike from Marseille to Gibraltar, and if necessary to Algiers. So I thought that that was a little bit hysterical on the part of the FBI. Interestingly enough, the Central Intelligence Agency, around the same time, says, yes, that's partly true, quote, the communists have sufficient strength to seize power in France whenever they may deem it desirable to. However, they contend that the French Communist Party has been told by the Kremlin that any coup would, quote, be contrary to the present policy of the Soviet Union. So, I mean, again, so you mix outright hysteria with a more reasoned or reasonable type of approach. You also see their attitude towards the left is interesting. I'll mention Italy, 1948 elections. They claim that many people are very worried about the communists winning the 1940 elections, the PCI, and that the Vatican's hysterical at the thought the communists might win the elections. It's very interesting how the CIA takes this. They're very calm about the whole thing. They prepare long documents. They obviously bring in specialists, Italian specialists, to look at this. But they've got many sort of trenches that they're defending. One is, they say, if the PCI, and it's a direct quote, and People's Bloc win the coalition, they'd be prevented by taking office by falsification of the returns. Or by force. Right? But, let's say that doesn't work. Still not a problem. Because what they say is, Italy would remain, this is under a communist government, quote, almost entirely dependent on the West for essential imports of scrap iron, steel, fertilizers required to maintain domestic product and foodstuffs. In fact, a communist-led Italy would do all in its power to avoid the denial of US dollar credits. So we'll try to fix the elections, we'll use military force, and if the communists come to power, we'll just present them with the economic realities of our strength that you have to do what we want anyhow. I also cite some sources about them splitting the trade union movement in France and Italy, fairly well known. So some of that stuff, sort of backs up things you already know. But here again, and as a historian, this is sort of an important historiographical lesson for me and for all of us. You have to be very careful about sources. Because, I still laugh at this, they quote a leader of the French communist-led union, the CGT's Dockers union leader, as, quote, admitting, and here's the direct quote, that airborne Soviet partisans have arrived in France. Now this is interesting because apparently neither the French government nor the CIA, although they looked, could find these Soviet partisans that had been brought into France. Right? But this was quoted to the people back in Washington as if this was a fact. Right? So I assume they may have misquoted the fellow, maybe their French wasn't very good, I have no idea, but it just seems like a little much. Now in terms of spying on the left in Eastern Europe, as my comrade was talking about, and other discussion of women in Eastern Europe, I wanted to just draw attention to 1953 where there's a worker rebellion in the German Democratic Republic. And what's interesting is what they publicly said was all what you would expect in terms of anti-communism, everything else. These people were nationalists, they wanted German unity, they wanted capitalism, and so on. That's not what their internal report said. Their internal reports, the CIA, said that the uprising was spontaneous, large-scale uprising, unquestionably partly resulted by the government, the East German government, harping on the themes of the 1917 Soviet uprising and analyzing the reasons that defeated the German workers' movement in 1933. These backfired. In other words, that the workers were rising up more or less the way they'd been trained by a communist government. And they also talked that, again, rather than this being led by people who love capitalism or anything else, that, quote, the shop stewards in the revolutionary tradition played a vital role in providing leadership and unity. East German developments have demonstrated that an uprising from below is possible. This also was not something they then publicized publicly. They did not want to stress those sort of things. So basically, I know I'm running out of time here. I just want to give you some idea of the sort of stuff you can find. Like you might say, well, of course they'd have attitudes like that towards the communists. What about, say, European social democrats? Well, after they apparently cut a deal with the Soviet Union to put up the Berlin Wall, or to allow the Berlin Wall to be put up, they are very dismissive of Social Democratic leader and later Chancellor Willy Brandt, who was mayor of West Berlin. They describe him, right, and they get very annoyed at him, and they talk about him getting temperamental and becoming hysterical after the division of Berlin. They actually send somebody to calm him down, right, because they're afraid it's just too much. And when asked about this, President Eisenhower is reflecting on this about why this was a good idea to make this deal with the Soviets. And it was after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they basically make the argument that Khrushchev, was in a bad light. They kind of had to give him something, because after all, and this shows the American mentality, Khrushchev had to be given something because, according to President Eisenhower, and I quote, "There is enough Oriental in the Soviets that face is important." So that's how American policy is determined, based on such usual racial stereotypes as the Oriental mind and so on. So basically, I mentioned various other factors about the penetration of the SDS. They love gossip, so when it turns out a lot of people testify to their agents, they don't know their agents, that, for example, later on, past 68, so to bring it in, the forum paper that Danny Cohn-Bendit is a sexist and is profiteering from the movement and so on. They put all that stuff in because, oh boy, we got all sorts of dirt on him. So they like that sort of interesting gossip. And they also bring up some interesting questions I'm not sure of. It's widely accepted by many historians that the United States government overthrew the Greek government and had the colonels come in and set up a dictatorship. The CIA claims that's not the case. They claim that they were preparing to buy the elections. So why would they overthrow the government? That's one point they make. Secondly, they thought even if they couldn't buy the elections, the same scenario about Italy, Greece would still have to do what they were told. But it's very interesting. They say the king came to him and said, yes, I was worried about the elections too, and I had a coup plan with the generals. But now these idiot colonels have come along, and they're terrible. So the king of Greece, according to the CIA, says the colonels who took over are stupid ultra-right-wing bastards who, having gained control of tanks, have brought disaster to Greece. So you have all these various scenarios, and the CIA gets the one scenario they weren't prepared for. These colonels come in, right? They wanted more, generals that they knew and people they could trust. So what's the point of all this then? Well, basically, my argument is that when you look at these intelligence reports that have been declassified, and I know it's a problem because we don't know which ones haven't been declassified, redacted, and so on, so it's not like I'm saying by any means we know all of this. The first thing is it sort of shows the problem of sort of having a historical bias and sort of looking at things in a certain way. American intelligence tend to see the left through the prism of the Cold War, and they sort of miss the development of the new left. Things like the German SDS only show up when it looks like they're going to be involved in strikes with socialist trade unionists. And all of a sudden, the CIA, branches in West Germany go, well, who are these guys, and what are they doing? And they're calling for strikes. This could be a problem. So they don't really have a good handle on that. So they mainly have that. But sometimes, right, despite that, those blinders, they come up with interesting things. I think it's interesting when they talk about the Antifa. I think it's interesting they see the spontaneous nature of the workers' revolt in East Germany and the fact that it was based on revolutionary traditions, various things like that. And also that they had a far less, how would I put it, all-powerful control over the situation than sometimes is assumed by the conspiracy theorists or even slightly paranoid people on the left. They always assume that, well, we've got these various things that may or may not work, and that's why we need a fallback plan. Right? We always have to consider a fallback plan, and that corruption was a major part of the fallback plan. It wasn't just that they thought they sort of could control all the events, but they thought, if nothing else, they could corrupt the situation. I mean, I didn't get to those documents outside the range of this paper, but I'm sure they'd be very happy about what happened to the Italian Communist Party, right? I mean, its evolution is something I'm sure that makes them happy, and when the documents are declassified, I'm sure it'll be proved that they did what they could to sort of encourage it. Like the 1948 elections in Italy, I think they spent the equivalent of $100 million buying votes, and so on and so forth. So I mean, they've always spent a lot of money on that. But I think this is sort of interesting. Now, I want to stress in conclusion that obviously none of this is in any way definitive. It's only indicative because you can't tell how many of the reports they're actually declassifying, and you're getting all these different sources where they don't identify the source, so you can't judge their competence. But I still think it's an interesting source as more and more of these documents come out, where you can sort of look and sort of see what what the spies are saying and so on. Right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, for a very interesting paper. Next, I'd like to welcome up to the front Irene Andersson of the University of Malmö and Roger Johansson from the University of Lund, who are going to present their paper to us on experiences from the 60s, activism for peace education in the 80s.
Thank you very much for letting us present here today, and thank you very much for organizing this conference. It's very interesting to be a part of it. Our paper is very much a paper in progress, but what we try to do there is to look on the peace question over a long time, and we would like to connect also the 50s, 60s and the 80s in the paper. We are looking into forms like organization, action, the repertoire of the movements, and also the changes over time in the concept of peace education. So that's what we try to do. If we're successful, you have to decide, but that's what we want to do. And there is a beginning one start of our work was when I was a coordinator for research at the teacher education, and the teacher education was moving, and we went through the archives. And when we went down to the archives, in the basement we also found the archives of the Teachers for Peace. So that was one way of starting this project, and that was also a lot of names of our older colleagues, so we could make a lot of interviews with them. So that's one part of the start for us. But I was also myself a part of the mobilization for peace against the Star Wars during the 80s. I don't know if someone here was also involved, perhaps. I could guess. Yeah. Okay. So this study is also a bit of a study of my own life and work. So it makes it very interesting. This is my colleague.
Yes, and I'm Irene Andersson, and I was not part of the peace movement. I was part of the women's movement. I was not into the movement of Women's for Peace, something like that. But in my dissertation, I studied women and peace movement from 1914 to 1940. And that was very interesting because I did it not in an organizational way, but I did not study organizations, but collective actions for peace, 1915 and 1935 in a Swedish context. And later on, I must say, because a lot of people have spoken about surveillance here in this room, and I have the opportunity in a governmental program to look into the socialist women, 1950s and 1960s in Sweden, the Swedish leftist association, who were really advocating peace also, and worked with the Stockholm Peace Appeal in 1950s, for instance. And I got money to look into the secret service, the secret police archives and the military archives about this surveillance, and it was very, very interesting. But this paper is not about surveillance. No. It's about the children and youth and how the government wanted to create new citizens for the future, and they were not subject for surveillance, and it was social democrats first.
At the time.
At the time.
Yes, and we don't try to make any new kind of another tradition here. We just try to emphasize that you could study the peace question in different temporal dimension. There is a long temporal dimension. I will not go back to the Bible, but you could go back to the May Day parade. So already in the late 1890s and early 20th century, the peace question was brought into the May Day parades all over the world. So there is a long tradition in peace questions. And there is also a middle long temporal dimension connected with social uprisings in different times. So this will be our connection with the 68, because there is similarities in the organization, in the repertoire and the action. And there is also times of outbreaks. And this is the outbreak of the 1980s peace movement we are studying or presenting now. That is, of course, a result of the Reagan-Star Wars. But you can see that there is a forerunner in the 50s for the radicalization also in the 60s, in the peace movement and the mobilization. And you can see it in the parades organized in Alderstone in England and the Eastern marches in Germany, for example. There is the Stockholm Appeal all over Europe with millions of people signing up. And also there was parts of it filled with direct action and interest in the global survival issues. And this comes up in the 60s with the emphasis on direct democracy, anti-militarism, and also the mobilization against the US war in Vietnam. But it was also connected with questions like a democratic education, a democratic research and participation, democratic participation. So the concept is widening. And this comes up in the mobilization in the peace movement in the 80s, connecting all these parts. Where occupational groups formed, like teachers for peace, but there were also doctors for peace and even generals for peace organized in Europe. So this became a huge movement. And a lot of the marches, organizing, the repertoire, you can find already in the 60s and also back in the 50s. So there is some kind of learning process. So our tentative point here is that the movements in the 60s already took shape in the 50s. And the peace movement in the 80s, 2 decades later, found its roots in the 60s. And our research is focusing to find those links between it, of course. So this is part of what we are going to present here. If we start with educators for peace, we had an extremely interesting seminar in October 2009 at Malmö University, where we had invited activists from the 80s, and they represented the National Board of Education in Sweden. They also represented the director for research and development of the teacher education. Educators also in teacher education, but also in compulsory school. And one question we asked them, what made you interested in peace issues? And there were different answers of that, of course. But it was, the mobilization in itself, but also the international questions. And also this student movement of '68. An older colleague of us, he had very close experience of the aftermath of the World War II and the Cold War. But it was also the development in Latin America and also the fight against apartheid in South Africa. So it's very much democratic questions linked from the 50s, 60s up to the 80s. And in what way it makes... No, I'm a little bit...
Too early.
Too early, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Irene. You don't want to run over the time, but you can see it all over in different areas. And this is from the metro in Stockholm. It's an artist, Celia Decker. She was in her mid-70s when she made made those drawings on concrete. And it took her 4 years. And you can see a part of the Marseillaise. There is also part of the International. There is also written piece in 50 languages. And she's also connecting the women liberation and ecological question with the peace issues here. And this is especially interesting because this metro station is situated in the most absolute fanciest area in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. So of course the persons who lived there were not that happy for this. So there was a huge debate.
Did you say it was in the 1960s?
Did I? It was in the mid-1960s, yes. So this is a way of to visualize how you can connect those questions from the 60s to the 80s, because in the mobilization in the 1980s, this is very well known drawings of that, or installations, what you want. We have also looked into textbooks in history in Sweden. And you can see how the concept of peace shifts within the textbooks. This is the first one. Is from the this is from the 1950s. If you have been a Swede, you have all been knowing who this person is. He's Dag Hammarskjöld. He was a Swede and he was the president of the United Nations. But the concept of peace in the textbooks is not violence, not war. And this is from a textbook later on. And it's visualizing another concept of peace. Peace includes a fair trade order. So suddenly you also talk about the fair peace, not only as absence of violence, but as a fair peace. And that's a complete other concept. And also you can find a lot about the liberation movements in the textbooks in history in Sweden, about Vietnam, about Africa and so on. And that's included in new concept. So it goes from absence of violence to a fair peace, you could say. So there is some kind of timeline from the 50s to the late 80s. also the national broadcasting started to make programs in Sweden on this theme. It basically starts in the 1978. It starts with the Star Wars. It's very close connected to that. And they've produced a lot of different programs. This is just some of them, but the titles say something. Star Wars and Peace, Life and Peace, Disarmament and Development. And those programs are basically made for teachers to support them in the teaching in the compulsory schools. And it's very interesting because those programs it's made up to a very certain date. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, and they don't make any program on that theme after that. So there is a perception of an unfair world order who activate people at the time. And the concept is very much active citizens and willingness to act, to do something, not only as someone who look upon something, because it's organized peace marches in schools. And Irene will talk about different kind of mobilization among school children. And also the peace work begins with the work with yourself and in your own values, very much connected to the values of the 1960s. So, this is my talk. Thank you for listening to me. Now we will come to the more During the time here, I can also say that I am the Vice President for the Labour Archives in Scania in the south of Sweden. So if someone here is interested in Labour Archives, please contact me. I know you are.
And you will also, of course, you know that Sweden was neutral at that time and had a neutral self-image from 1914, I think. And so we have grown up in this neutral society. And this school was also a part of this, of course. In 1973, we have a children's book called From a Cow's Diary. This cow is doing nothing. Every day is the same. It's rain is pouring down outside, or the sun is shining, and she is looking at the spider or looking out of the window, and nothing is happening. She eats and she sleeps, and she eats and she sleeps. And then one day she falls asleep and dreams. And she dreams a lot of things. She dreams that she eats ice cream, she learns how to bike and use a bicycle, and she goes to a movie and so on. And then she also goes to UN. She spoke in UN, created peace in the whole world. This is a rather famous little book in Sweden, and it was also there was a new publication of the book in 1980s, and a small film, and this film are shown in the TV today also. And this is everyone could contribute to peace, even cows. Could be a message. And this, well, there are a lot of materials like this, but we have been interested in looking into the narratives in these textbooks and these school materials produced by different organizations outside of school and wanted to come in and be agents in school. At that time we didn't have any free schools in Sweden, and it was very homogeneous school, and you couldn't think about any other way of making schools in Sweden. So, but there was some initiatives. Alva and Gunnar Myrdal Foundation and Save the Children and Swedish UN Association made some textbooks who were aimed for schools. It was called Peace, Freedom and Justice in the 1980s. They were small children and they were for older children, and there were a lot of facts in them, and the narratives are you must do something. The core message is knowledge, feeling and action. And according to the age of the children, feeling was for the small children, and knowledge and action, and maybe feeling for the older, if they could be moved at all. But it is active, committed individuals, not passive spectators, that Swedish schools must try to produce. So we have had a lot of, the peace education had a lot of support on the National Board of Teachers' Education and so on. And if you analyze the narratives, you can see that they wanted children and the youth to be political subjects, to go out in the community, to work for peace, to be mates on the peace road, to start to know a lot of things and to start activities. This is the first for the small children, to foster children for peace. And this is a very classical picture. Small children holding hands for the world. It was also, the picture was also from the 1950s, I think, on the copybook, the book of maps, if you had that at school. All children from different race and different origins and different countries were holding hands together. So it was rather the message about harmonizing with the small children. But this is a North-South dialogue, of course, and it's for small children from 1 to 3 years old. No, the first class, at the 7 to 9 years old. And this is for some older children. This is the age where I've been teaching a lot. It's from 10 to 12 years old. I've been a teacher for those children for 20 years. And you can see the demonstration. They could be out and demonstrate. And they can also be mates on the peace road to do something. And the interesting thing is that the girl is rather active here. And these are from for the secondary school. And you can see a rather traditional symbol also with a broken rifle. And this is a peace need you. But inside, they also used a lot of the comic strips. And this is a comic that was produced during 5 years or something like that. It's about this girl. She's called Mafalda. And a package is carrying, the man is carrying a package and it says fragile. And the girl says to the boy, it was just a piece who was carrying away in a little box. So it was fragile, the piece. And this is, she is listening to older men. Oh, change the world. That's for youth, not for us. Even if I had those ideas as young, well, I wouldn't do it today. And she is thinking, hello, children, mates, we must hurry up and change the world, because the world will change us if we grow older. So it's really children's perspective in those books. And there's a lot of those comic strips. And then I found some very interesting materials, also some source materials about the School Peace Project, the Labour Peace Forum movement, which now is Olof Palme's Peace Center. And I have analyzed the networks and how they did it and how they came about. And they did school essays, competitions, 1982, 1985, 1987, 88. 1990-92, because they wanted, they're all connected to elections in Sweden, and they wanted to go into the school and persuade the children and the youth to be part of the peace activities and to be social democrats, of course. So this is their message about peace education. Grown-ups should listen to the new generation, explain difficult questions in the international society, all work with children and youth, encourage to engagement. That's their responsibility. Peace education, the project, reflect the basic values of the labour movement. So they were really outspoken about this. And the schools gave simplified images of conflicts and international understanding, and therefore they had to help. The labour movement contributed with solidarity, positive values and tools for achieving different perspectives on the knowledge of production. And here is a letter from 1982. I just wanted to show the dove with a red flag flying. Peace Forum of the Swedish Labour Movement, President Alva Myrdal, Vice President. She got the Nobel Peace Prize and she died shortly after this. And this is the poster who was sent out to the schools. The peace is necessary, peace is possible. And if they won, they were going to write essays, and if they won, they could go to FN's, do a disarmament conference in 1982. They had 10 students go there. And then they got a diploma for participating in the competition for a very good essay and a very good activity for peace. And this is a woman, of course, saying, well, little chap here, you are not going out and fight. I am going to break all the weapons in the world. There is a competition. It's 40 years since Hiroshima, and the people who were, the students who won her were going to Japan to a week to see Hiroshima. And there you see all the children also doing a lot of things we shall overcome. This is a special figure. She's called Rebella, the Swedish female rebellion. So the narratives in this are rather, in this material sent out to the schools, are very dramatic. It's against atomic catastrophe, and the images are really, hurry up, they're hardly any time to lose. They're so dramatic, I think, but then there's every time this has been too dramatic, there's a turning point. You can help. And that's against armament in the world, and I see that should be didn't spell it right, and UN disarmament could be against it to work with it. And on justice and solidarity. But if you work in unions and engagement in the peace movement and the labour movement, we can change the situation. So, that's all.
If I could invite the speakers just back up to the front, and we'll take